She vanished without a sound. No final radio call, no sign of a struggle. One moment she was there, trekking through one of the most dangerous environments on Earth, and the next she was gone. Her name was Eva Sorensen, and 5 years ago, she disappeared deep in the Amazon rainforest. Her mission had been simple: locate and document a cluster of rare ghost orchids thought to exist only in uncharted sections of the Javari Valley. What followed was anything but simple. No rescue was ever mounted. No body was recovered, just silence, and a forest that swallowed every trace of her like it had been waiting to do so all along. The Amazon is more than a jungle. It's a living, breathing labyrinth of heat, shadows, and noise. Millions of species, many still undiscovered. Unmapped rivers. Indigenous tribes who have never encountered the modern world. And in the middle of it all, Eva, a lone biologist with a notebook, a camera, and a stubborn belief that the jungle would somehow welcome her. She underestimated it. In the days following her disappearance, the area was searched on foot and by air. But the rainforest is not kind to search teams. Tracks vanish within hours. Calls are drowned by the hum of insects and birds. The canopy hides everything. Equipment fails. Maps lie. No sign of Eva was ever found. It was as if the forest had decided to keep her for itself. Then, 5 years later, something surfaced. Something small. Insignificant at first glance. A damaged field notebook. Found by accident. But inside it sketches, coordinates, fragments of something much bigger. A different kind of trail. One no GPS could have mapped, and it pointed toward a place no one was ever meant to find. This isn't just the story of a missing person. It's the unraveling of a mystery buried beneath layers of vines, bone, and silence. A story about obsession, belief, and what happens when you walk into a place older than time looking for answers it never promised to give. The Amazon keeps its secrets, but every so often, the jungle exhales and what it releases changes everything. Eva Sorensen didn't just disappear. She stepped through a door, and 5 years later, that door is creaking open. Eva Sorensen wasn't a thrill seeker. Not in the way people assume when they hear the story. She didn't skydive or chase storms or climb Everest without oxygen. She was quiet, analytical. The kind of person who read Latin names aloud and talked to plants like they were old friends. But she also had that particular kind of restlessness you only find in people who are searching for something they can't quite name. At 28, she was already one of the youngest biologists at Sweden's National Botanic Institute. Her specialty was rare, orchids, particularly the elusive ghost orchid, a flower so rare it seemed more myth than plant. She'd studied its dispersal patterns, its dependencies on fungi, even the folk stories surrounding it. And when she saw a blurry photograph in an old Brazilian field report showing what looked like the orchid blooming somewhere deep in the Javari Valley, she couldn't stop thinking about it. Most researchers would have dismissed it. Too remote. Too dangerous. The region was known for uncontacted tribes, drug routes, and territories where maps ended mid-page. But Eva believed in things she could not yet prove. And that belief had a gravity to it. She wasn't reckless. She was deliberate. She planned. She trained. She learned basic Portuguese, mapped migration seasons, and studied every recorded expedition that had ever made it into that corner of the Amazon. Then she packed a lightweight camera, a waterproof field journal, and a tiny silver compass that had belonged to her grandfather. She flew into Sao Paulo alone, boarded a rickety twin-engine plane into the interior, and finally met up with a small independent survey team preparing for a biodiversity study. She introduced herself as just the orchid girl, but they quickly realized Eva knew more about the region's plant life than most of them put together. She was calm in a storm, precise with a scalpel, and oddly at peace in the thick, breathless air of the jungle. It was as if she belonged there. But belonging doesn't mean safety. And on the morning of her disappearance, she didn't tell anyone where exactly she was going, just that she'd be back by nightfall. She never came back. The Javari Valley is not a place people just wander into. It's one of the most isolated regions in the world, wedged between Brazil and Peru, where the rainforest folds in on itself like a breathing, green ocean. No cell signal, no roads, no rescue if something goes wrong, and that's where Eva was headed. The independent expedition team she joined called themselves the Orinoco Initiativa, loose collection of field researchers, botanists, and documentarians with an interest in mapping biodiversity where governments had little reach. It wasn't a polished operation, no institutional funding. Just passion, sweat, and a few permits that worked more as hopeful gestures than legal protections. When Eva arrived in Tabatinga, The team was already preparing supply bags, machetes, water filters, solar chargers. She fit in immediately, quiet but capable, eyes always scanning the tree line. From the outset, Eva made her intentions clear. She wasn't there for prestige or to publish papers. She was chasing something few others cared about, an undocumented orchid species rumored to bloom for only a week in the understory near remote tributaries where even birds avoided nesting. She believed the Javari held it. The others thought she was grasping at shadows, but none of them doubted her resolve. They traveled by dugout canoe for days, following winding Blackwater rivers until GPS was useless and maps blurred into hand-drawn sketches. By the time they reached the intended survey zone, the forest was a different world. Heat hung like smoke. The air buzzed constantly, thick with moisture and unseen wings. Every step forward felt like walking into a living organism. Their guides were silent men, wary and efficient, who refused to go past a certain point on the map. Tribo sem contado, one of them said. No go. Uncontacted tribe territory. The team agreed to camp just outside the buffer. Eva nodded but said nothing. That night, she sketched orchids by headlamp, her journal pages damp from humidity. The next morning, she packed light, just a day pack. Her camera, notebook, and field knife, and told the others she'd circle back by sundown. She wanted to check an unusual cluster of canopy breaks she'd seen from the river. The team had no reason to doubt her. She was methodical, always checking in. But that day, she didn't. By nightfall, Eva Sorensen was gone. The camp had been basic, but functional. Hammocks slung between trees, tarps staked into the wet soil, and gear piled into waterproof barrels. Smoke from a breakfast fire still clung to the clearing when Eva set off that morning. The sun was barely above the canopy. She had her journal tucked under her arm, machete clipped to her belt, and a quiet focus that made her almost invisible as she vanished between the trees. She told no one exactly which route she'd take, just that she'd be back before dusk. It was an unusual field. Biologists often worked in pairs or alone, covering ground quickly in shifting light. Eva had done solo surveys before, always logging her position and checking back in. The rainforest, though, is unforgiving. Paths dissolve behind you, footprints vanish within minutes. And sound behaves differently in the Amazon. It bends, echoes, disappears. Yelling is useless, radios fail. You are alone in the most complete sense of the word. By late afternoon, the sky had darkened prematurely. Rain fell in heavy sheets, smearing the forest into streaks of green and gray. The team waited longer than they should have before worrying. First, they told themselves she was delayed by field notes, then by terrain, then maybe she'd just lost track of time. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the cicadas erupted in waves, the mood shifted from patience to dread. They tried to retrace her steps, but Eva had left no markers. The undergrowth was unbroken. No broken branches, no dropped gear, not even a snapped fern. The only thing left behind was a folded page from her journal beside her, hammock sketched with a peculiar orchid, annotated with a single word. Proximity? At midnight, 2 team members ventured out with headlamps, calling her name in every direction. Nothing. Just frogs, dripping leaves, and that low, ever-present hum of something watching. By morning, the camp was silent. No one touched her gear. No one said what they were all thinking. She had walked into the forest, and it had decided not to return her. By the second morning, fear had settled over the camp like a fog no sun could lift. Eva had been missing for over 24 hours, and in the Amazon, time is more than critical, it's cruel. The forest doesn't wait. It consumes. The Orinoco Initiative team launched their own search with what little they had: boots, machetes, GPS units barely functioning through the canopy, and 2 radios that hissed more static than sound. They spread out in 3 directions, calling her name, whistling, leaving markers with strips of yellow cloth. It was futile. The jungle closed behind them as quickly as it opened, every tree a mirror of the last. Rain came in violent bursts, turning the forest floor into a soup of mud and leaves. They moved blindly, soaked to the bone, slipping on wet roots, swarmed by mosquitoes. The air was thick with decay. They found nothing. No gear, no clothing, no voice calling back. Just silence. The kind that hums in your skull until you start hearing things that aren't there. One of the searchers, a documentary cameraman, thought he saw movement just beyond the ridge, a flash of white through the trees. He ran, tripped, came back shaking. I thought it was her, he muttered, but it wasn't. On the third day, the team's medic found a half-melted footprint near a tree root. Too small for any of the men. Could have been Eva's. Could have been anyone's. Could have been nothing. They lit signal fires that smoked in the rain and sent drones that crashed into trees within seconds. Each night, the jungle grew louder. Monkeys screamed, birds cried out with human-like voices. And the fear shifted no longer just for Eva, but for what else might be out there. Watching. Waiting. After 5 days, they reached the limits of their supplies and strength. The search had yielded no trail, no trace, no sense. It was as if she'd never existed. Just a hammock left swaying under the tarp and a sketch of a flower no one recognized. The rainforest had taken her, swallowed her whole, and left nothing behind but questions and a silence too complete to explain. When the team finally reached the nearest outpost with satellite access, their faces were gaunt, eyes sunken, voices quiet. They sent a message to Brazilian authorities, then another to the Swedish consulate, then a third to the Amazon Basin Rescue Command. Days passed. No one came. The Orinoco Initiative wasn't an official government agency. They didn't have the weight of institutions behind them, just field credentials, a few scientific sponsors, and a missing person deep inside one of the most jurisdictionally tangled zones on Earth. The Javari Valley sits in a knot of conflicting boundaries: federally protected rainforest, indigenous reserves, unpatrolled borderlands, and territory overseen by FUNAI, Brazilian agency responsible for indigenous affairs. Entering some areas without permits is considered a crime. So is contacting certain tribes. The team had been careful, but in the eyes of red tape, they were just outsiders with muddy boots and a missing biologist. A local official responded after 48 hours. His tone was clipped. "There are protocols," he said. "Indigenous lands require clearance. Military approval needed for air support. No rescue flights without authorization." Another day passed, then a week. Eric Sorensen, Eva's older brother, flew in from Stockholm. Jet-lagged, furious, determined. He stormed into government offices, flashing her photo. "She's out there," he said. "Why aren't you looking?" He was met with shrugs, delays, and the soft grind of bureaucracy. It wasn't that they didn't care. It was that caring came with paperwork. The Peruvian side offered no help. They said it was Brazil's problem. Brazil said the location was unclear. One official asked if Eva had possibly wandered into narco territory. Another suggested jaguar attack. Another, quietly, said what no one wanted to hear. "Sometimes people vanish here. No one ever finds them." The media didn't bite. It was one story in a year filled with bigger headlines. A biologist, a rainforest, a missing woman, no footage, no drama. Just a growing list of stalled reports and diplomatic silences. By the end of the second week, the search had been quietly downgraded. "Unrecoverable zone," one report read. The file was closed. But Eric didn't go home. Not then. Not for years. Because something about the way it all unraveled didn't sit right. Not the timing. Not the silence. Not the way she vanished. Something had taken his sister, and it wasn't just the jungle. The call came at 3:17 a.m. Stockholm time. Eric Sorensen sat up in bed, disoriented by the hour and the urgency in the voice on the other end. "Eva didn't return from the field," they said. "She's missing." He asked the only question a brother can ask in that moment. "How long has it been?" The silence that followed was all he needed to hear. By the end of the day, Eric was on a flight to Brazil, clutching a dog-eared photo of Eva, taken a year earlier, her in hiking boots, crouched beside a blooming orchid, eyes full of quiet joy. She had always been the soul of the family, curious, compassionate, the kind of person who saw beauty in things others overlooked, and now she was gone. When he arrived in Manaus, the consulate was apologetic. The rainforest was vast, they said, dangerous. Search efforts had been logistically challenging. The region was governed by overlapping authorities: FUNAI, IBAMA, state and federal police. There were limits to what could be done. Eric pressed harder. Demanded they keep looking. Hired a translator. Filed a petition. But it always came back to the same phrases. "It's too remote. Too politically sensitive. Too late." He traveled to the field base himself. The Orinoco team was still shaken, hollowed out from what they'd seen and failed to see. They recounted every detail, every search pattern, every dead end. Eric asked if she might have simply gotten lost. They said no. Eva was too smart for that. Too prepared. Something else had happened. They just didn't know what. Eva's parents refused to speak to reporters. Her mother stopped answering calls altogether. Her father issued a short statement. "Our daughter went into the forest seeking life. We ask that no one forget her." But there was no closure to be had. Not yet. Not with the jungle refusing to give anything back. Eric stayed, slept in hostels, printed flyers in 3 languages, offered money to anyone who could help. But every official avenue was closed. Too many risks, too many unknowns. No more resources would be deployed. The jungle had swallowed his sister, and the world, it seemed, had already moved on. It didn't take long for the whispers to begin. In the small riverside towns near the Javari, stories spread faster than facts. Some said Eva had been attacked by a jaguar, her body dragged into the underbrush. Others believed river pirates had intercepted her, mistaking her for a government agent or a foreign journalist. Still more suspected she'd wandered too close to cartel land territory patrolled by armed smugglers who dealt in things far darker than drugs. Eric heard them all. He listened to fishermen and market vendors, guides and hunters. Most were eager to speak, to spin tales soaked in mystery. But one man, an older guide named Paulo, did not embellish. He simply looked Eric in the eye and said, "Sometimes the forest takes people." Eric asked what he meant. "She stepped where she shouldn't have," Paulo said. "There are places in the Javari no map shows, places even the animals avoid. Old ground, you go there, the forest watches. And if it doesn't want you to leave it, won't." It was the kind of thing you might write off as superstition. But in the Amazon, myth and reality blur. Eric learned of stories going back decades. Lone explorers vanishing without a trace, tribes who spoke of invisible ones, who lived between the leaves, and an uncontacted people some claimed could walk without sound, without footprint. Some said these tribes saw the outside world as sickness, that they protected the land by keeping it hidden permanently. There were older rumors, too, of cursed flora, ritual grounds, ghost flowers that only bloom once in a generation, and only where blood has fallen. But it wasn't all legend. At a dusty bar near the Letitia border, a boat mechanic told Eric he'd seen a lone figure on the riverbank weeks after Eva vanished. A woman, blonde, dirty, staring out at the water. When he'd called out, she disappeared into the trees. It might have been real, or it might have been another echo of the jungle's favorite trick-making "you see what you want," just before it takes it away again. The rumors didn't slow Eric down. If anything, they hardened his resolve. Because the deeper he went, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a disappearance. It was a story the forest was trying to erase. Weeks passed, then months. The jungle did what it always does. It grew back over the footprints, the tents, the trails, the search grids. It swallowed the urgency, the noise, the scent of strangers. Eva's case, once a spark of international concern, became another unsolved name on a list too long to read. The Swedish consulate updated their website with a brief statement. Search concluded. No confirmed sightings. Investigation remains open but inactive. No leads. No evidence. No answers. The media turned its gaze elsewhere. Headlines moved on to politics, pandemics, and conflict. Eva's story lost its place on the ticker. The Post stopped. The shares dried up. The last article, buried 6 pages deep, called it a tragic mystery in the Amazon. That was it. But Eric didn't stop. He refused to pack up, refused to mourn. He stayed in Brazil, cycling through rented rooms and borrowed couches. He taught himself rudimentary Portuguese. He spent every waking hour mapping Eva's last known coordinates, overlaying satellite images, building theories. He retraced her route with hired guides who thought he was chasing ghosts. He paid them anyway. At night, he read her old blog post dispatches from Peru, Madagascar, Borneo. There was a quiet poetry to the way she saw the world. Plants weren't just data to her. They were stories, symbols, clues. One journal entry from 3 months before her disappearance kept him awake more than any other. "There are species we only see once, like messages whispered through the canopy. You have to be still enough to hear them." By the first anniversary of her disappearance, Eric had become part of the jungle's background noise. Locals recognized him. Some avoided him. Others pitied him. But no one had answers. Just stories. Always more stories. The rainforest had gone silent again. And Eva's Kaysher name, her mission, her voice was being swallowed by time. But then, almost a year later, something surfaced. Not a person, not a body, but a page. And with it, The forest spoke again. It was a fisherman who found it. Midday, July heat pressing against the river like a furnace, sweat dripping into the boat's wood grain. He was pulling in nets near a marshy bend off the Rio Icha, nearly 200 miles from where Eva had vanished, when something snagged in the reeds. Not a fish, not driftwood. A weather-worn field notebook bloated from rain, half buried in algae, edges chewed by insects. He almost tossed it, but then he saw the symbol sketched on the back cover, a crude outline of an orchid, drawn in black ink, petals reaching upward like smoke. He turned it over, opened it carefully. The writing was faded, smeared in places, but still legible. English, Swedish, bits of Portuguese, technical notes, plant names, altitude readings, then something else. Too quiet today. Forest watching. Petals open like eyes. Light came from north slope. Not sunlight, not right. Saw something move between trees, not human, not animal, still watching. Some entries read like field observations. Others like fragments of a mind unraveling. Pages were torn out. Whole sections blacked over with charcoal. One page was completely consumed by a drawing thick, frenzied lines depicting what looked like a woman kneeling in front of a circle of plants, their roots reaching for her like fingers. The fisherman took the notebook to a trader, who took it to a local university, where it eventually made its way to the hands of a visiting botanist who recognized the name, Eva Sorensen. When Eric held it in his hands for the first time, it felt warm, heavy, like it had been waiting. He flipped through it slowly, careful not to let the pages crumble. There were coordinates, elevation sketches, hand-drawn maps of trails no official chart showed. But one thing stood out, a repeated symbol inked again and again across the margins. A ring of petals encircling an eye. In the final entry, dated the day before her disappearance, Eva wrote 6 words. I found it. It's not alone. No one could say what she meant. But Eric knew this wasn't over. It was just beginning. The discovery of the notebook reignited a wildfire. News of its recovery spread first through niche forums and survivalist blogs, then to larger platforms hungry for mystery. Eva's name resurfaced now, accompanied by phrases like jungle possession, uncontacted tribe abduction, and botanist-turned-forest ghost. Everyone had a theory, and no one had the truth. Some believed Eva had joined an indigenous tribe, shedding her old life like a cocoon. She went native, one headline claimed, quoting an anonymous source with no credentials. Others believed she was alive, but brainwashed, taken by a cult rumored to live off-grid, practicing ancient rituals in the canopy. Reddit threads exploded with satellite images, half-legible GPS data from her notebook, and blurry photos of lone figures glimpsed along rivers. Every pixel became potential proof. Every silence, a conspiracy. The most popular theory came from a former British soldier-turned-survivalist influencer who posted a video claiming Eva had faked her disappearance to live off the grid. He pointed to the deliberate tone of her journal entries and claimed she had psychologically prepped herself for isolation. His followers ate it up. Never mind the fact that Eva left behind her passport, her family, and everything she knew. In the court of public opinion, mystery demanded narrative. Then came the darker theories. Paranormal blogs dissected her sketches, arguing they contained encoded sigils or references to ancient jungle deities. One entry, they claimed, was an invocation. Another, a warning. A fringe YouTube channel with 300 subscribers created a mini-documentary titled Ghost Orchid, the Eva Sorensen Ritual. It featured eerie music, manipulated drone footage, and a theory that Eva had become part of the forest willingly or otherwise. But while the world speculated, Eric dug deeper. He wasn't looking for spectacle, he was looking for a pattern. And one evening, scanning indigenous records, he found something. A match. Eva's hand-drawn symbolth ring of petals around a single eye was nearly identical to a design found on ceremonial bark cloth in a remote region of the Javari. A symbol used, according to the translation, to mark thresholds between worlds. It wasn't proof, but it was something. And it was about to lead him to a man who claimed to have seen where Eva went, and why she never came back. He lived alone, perched at the edge of a slow-moving tributary in a thatched hut so covered in moss it looked like it had grown from the earth itself. Locals called him Antonio, but those who knew better called him O Vidente, the seer. Eric had heard of him through a contact at a field station, a retired anthropologist who once studied oral traditions along the Javari. Antonio wasn't a shaman in the modern sense. He didn't sell ayahuasca tours or perform rituals for tourists. He didn't speak much at all, but he knew things especially about the forest, where it was safe, where it wasn't. When Eric showed him the notebook, Antonio didn't touch it. He just looked at the symbol on the cover, his eyes narrowing. "She crossed," he said. "Crossed where?" Eric asked. The old man gestured with 2 fingers like slicing through fabric. "There are places in the forest where the trees are not trees, where light doesn't fall the same way, where sound dies in your throat. Your sister went into one of those places." "Do you mean a hidden valley? A tribe?" Antonio shook his head. "Not tribe, not people. Spirits. The ones before people. They are still there, still watching." It sounded like nonsense. But his voice wasn't theatrical. It was flat. Certain. "She went near the ironroot trees," he continued. "You know them by their black bark and the way animals will not go near. That place is marked. We do not pass it. It is where the veil is thin." "What veil?" Eric asked. Antonio didn't answer right away. He reached into a small pouch and pulled out a torn piece of bark. On it, etched with soot and oil, was the same symbol from Eva's notebook. "She saw something she should not see," he whispered. "She followed it. They always follow." "Do you think she's alive?" The old man looked away, into the trees. "Not like you mean." Eric pressed for more. A location, a path, anything. But Antonio wouldn't say, just one final sentence, spoken softly as he turned away. "If you go looking for her in that place, the forest may not give you back either." And with that, the conversation was over. But Eric knew where he had to go next. 5 years. That's how long it had been since Eva vanished into the jungle. 5 years since Eric had last heard her voice. Since he stood in that sweltering camp, clutching the hammock where she slept, whispering her name into trees that never answered. He never really left the Amazon, only relocated the search. Between flights back and forth, months in Sweden spent working temp jobs to fund his return, and long nights spent scouring satellite data, Eric had become something else entirely. Not just a grieving brother, but a man haunted by a mystery that refused to stay buried. The world had forgotten, but he hadn't. By now, Eric's apartment in Manaus resembled an evidence room, walls covered in maps, string connecting red pins, printouts of Eva's journal pages, annotated in pen. He had converted the symbols into crude digital overlays, cross-referenced vegetation patterns, cross-checked her sketches against infrared satellite scans. He had even traced humidity spikes in the Javari during the week she disappeared, hoping for some hidden variable. Most called it obsession. He called it survival. But it was the notebook recovered near the Isa River that finally gave him direction. A rough coordinate scrawled in the margin. A pattern in her sketches that matched the root systems of a species of ironbark tree known to grow in only one quadrant of the valley. In one photo, blurry and water-damaged, that changed everything. Eva standing beside a gnarled tree, her hand resting on its bark. Her expression was not fear, it was reverence. Eric couldn't ignore it. Not anymore. He used the last of his savings to buy gear, high-frequency radios, filtration kits, solar chargers. He sent encrypted emails to guides, most of whom refused when they heard where he wanted to go. It wasn't just the terrain. It was the stories. But eventually, 2 said yes. Veterans of the forest, men who didn't care about ghosts or rumors, only money and clear plans. They would leave in a week. And Eric knew this was it. He hadn't come back just to search. He had come to finish what Eva started. Even if it meant walking into the same silence that took her. They departed at dawn, paddling upriver beneath a sky bruised with morning haze. Eric sat between the 2 hired guides, Lucas, ex-military with a machete like a second limb, and Mendez, a soft-spoken tracker whose eyes missed nothing. Their canoe slipped quietly along a Blackwater tributary, the forest pressing in like a breathing wall on either side. Every hour brought them deeper into the unrecorded. The GPS flickered, then died. Compass needles jittered. Even the birds grew quiet. It was as if the jungle knew they were coming. By day 3, the trail Eva had taken was no longer a trail, just flattened growth in the underbrush, long reclaimed. But Mendez spotted signs. A cut in the vine, unnatural angles in the canopy, a single rusted nail embedded in a tree where a tarp had once hung. They were close. Not to Eva, but to the last place she had stood in this world. Rain came like a punishment, sheets of it drenching them in minutes, flooding their boots. They pushed forward anyway, machetes carving through vines thick as rope. Spiders the size of palms dropped from branches. Frogs screamed in bursts. Somewhere far off, a low growl rippled through the air, jaguar or thunder. It was hard to tell. That night, they camped beneath a stand of cebas. Mendez made a fire, but it refused to catch. Eric sat with Eva's notebook on his lap, the page marked with her last recorded coordinates. He stared at it until sleep overtook him. In his dream, he saw her not running, not lost, but kneeling in a clearing, her hands resting on black soil, her face turned towards something just beyond the tree line. The next morning, they found the ironbark grove. The trees were twisted, their bark as dark as oil, roots like grasping fingers breaking through the earth. No birds called, no insects buzzed. The air was wrong too, still, too cold, like the forest was holding its breath. Lucas muttered something in Portuguese and refused to go farther. Mendez stared into the trees and whispered, "We're not alone." Eric stepped forward. This was the place Eva had marked. And somewhere in this abyss, the forest still held its secrets. Waiting. It started with a tree doll, ancient, its trunk wider than a car, roots like coiled serpents wrapped in moss. Mendez was the first to spot it. He called Eric over without a word, just pointed upward, his face unreadable. 10 feet above the ground, carved deep into the bark, was a symbol. Not a name, not a heart and initials. A symbol. Sharp, deliberate lines arranged in a spiral, circles nested inside one another. It was the same shape Eric had seen dozens of times in Eva's notebook, drawn in margins, etched over map coordinates, scribbled repeatedly like she was trying to remember or forget. But this one wasn't drawn in ink. It had been cut into the tree with something sharp. Clean edges, old but preserved, protected by the tree's slow, living skin. Not random, not weather damage. And it wasn't alone. As they moved through the grove, they found more high on trunks, always well above eye level. Some were variations of the spiral, others entirely new. An inverted triangle flanked by claw-like arcs, a ring broken by a single slash. None of it matched any known tribal markings. No ethnographic record, no colonial influence. These weren't messages, they were warnings. Mendez called them marcas de feitiço, sorcery marks, said they were sometimes used to designate forbidden zones, places where the spirits were restless or something older slept. Lucas muttered a prayer under his breath and tightened the strap on his machete. But Eric didn't stop. Couldn't. Each mark was a breadcrumb, a confirmation. Eva had been here. She had seen these, maybe even carved them herself. Then they found the tree with the gouges. It looked like claws at first, 3 long slashes, deep and ragged. But the spacing was too precise, too measured. And at the base of the tree, a small pile of stones, arranged in a circle, with a single orchid placed at the center. Dead, wilted, but unmistakable. The silence was absolute now, not even the usual rustle of wind through leaves, just the feeling of being watched, not by animals. By something else? Eric stepped closer to the mark and reached up, tracing the symbol with his fingers. It was still sharp, still fresh, and it felt like someone had left it there for him. They weren't expecting to find anything solid. Not after 5 years. Not in a place where the jungle reclaims everything in days. But Mendez spotted something odd near the base of a collapsed palm fabric, sun-bleached and torn, tangled in a mess of vines and fungal rot. It wasn't local, not plant-based. It was synthetic. They cut it loose and laid it flat. A piece of dark green backpack canvas, frayed edges, one side marked with faded black marker, ES. Eric's knees went weak. He had seen that fabric before Eva's expedition gear from the 2018 field photos. She used to write her initials on everything, even her boots. Mendez didn't say anything, just moved methodically, circling the area with the slow patience of a predator. He stopped near a fallen log, half-rotted, covered in termite trails and slime mold. Then he knelt, gently brushed aside the damp leaves. A boot. Partially buried, mold-stained, laces torn. But the brand was visible. Swedish military issue, Eva's size. Eric said nothing. Couldn't. He reached for it with trembling hands, turning it over. Something clattered against the wood below. A memory card. Micro SD. Crusted with dirt, corroded around the edges. It had been tucked beneath the log, possibly dropped or hidden. Mendez handed it to Eric silently, then stood, scanning the tree line. Every leaf now felt like a pair of eyes. This wasn't just evidence. It was presence. They were in her path, walking behind her like shadows. The backpack piece, the boot, the card, they weren't random, they were placed. As if someone had been trying to leave behind a trail, Or maybe trying to erase one and missed a piece. Lucas was done. He refused to continue without air support. Said it flatly, like a man drawing a line between the living and the disappeared. But Eric didn't hesitate. He slipped the card into a dry case, tied the bootlace into his belt, and held the backpack scrap like a relic. Eva had been here. These were her things. She had survived at least for a while. And whatever happened to her next, it had started here. It took 2 days to recover anything from the memory card. Back at a remote research outpost with a functioning laptop and data recovery software, Eric watched the screen flicker to life with a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. There were 37 video files. Most were corrupted, shattered fragments of digital noise and stuttering audio, but 7 played cleanly. They were raw field logs, time-stamped in sequence, each one a window into Eva's final days. The first few were typical of her style, calm, precise, softly spoken. She documented a dense thicket of orchids in full bloom, their pale petals veined with purple, hanging like ghosts from moss-draped branches. "This is a cluster I haven't seen before," she said, her voice steady. "They weren't here yesterday. I'm certain of it." She panned the camera slowly. The area was silent, too silent. The next video, a day later, showed her face. Dirt on her cheek, eyes tired. She whispered as if trying not to be overheard. "There are voices at night," she said, glancing over her shoulder. "Not words, just sounds. I thought it was frogs at first, but it's not. It's inside the trees." She laughed then, a nervous, sharp breath. "I know how that sounds." Another clip. Dawn light slicing through the mist. Eva filming something in the distance, blurry, half obscured. "There's something moving," she whispered. "It doesn't make noise. It's not an animal. It moves like it's listening." One file showed her standing beside a tree, covered in symbolsons, identical to those Eric had found carved high above the forest floor. She placed her hand on the bark. Her voice cracked. "They weren't here when I passed through yesterday." She wasn't afraid. Not yet. But something had shifted. The forest wasn't background anymore. It was watching her. And she was beginning to see it. The video files grew darker, not just in content, but in quality. Glitches appeared. Audio dropped out. Colors bled at the edges, like the camera itself had started to rot. The 5th recording opened with Eva's face lit only by the faint blue of her headlamp. Her hair was soaked. Her voice was low, fractured. "I tried to retrace my steps today. Everything's changed. The landmarks are gone. It's like the forest moved while I was sleeping." She paused, staring into the lens. "I don't know what day it is." The next clip cut in without warning. The lens was tilted sideways, filming her feet trudging through mud, bleeding. She was talking to herself now. "There's something following me. Not close, but always there. It doesn't want me to leave." She hadn't eaten. The camera shook in her hand. Her voice cracked from dehydration. Yet she kept filming. "I thought I saw my mother in the trees today," she murmured. She was just standing there, staring. When I blinked, she was gone. Another cut, her voice rising in pitch. "It's not the plants, it's not the animals, it's the silence. It knows I hear it." Then, the final clip. It began with the sound of rain, heavy, distant thunder rolling through the canopy. The camera was pointed straight up, catching only the black outline of trees against a flash of lightning. And then came the screaming. Not hers. Something else. Something that didn't sound like it belonged in any human throat. The camera fell to the ground, half submerged in mud. A blur of movement, branches thrashing, a shape barely visible moving across the frame with unnatural speed. The scream rose again, distorted, echoing into static. Then silence. Total. Eric sat frozen. The last timestamp was exactly 3 days after Eva's disappearance. There were no more clips. Just digital snow, and the sound of breathing that might not have been hers. It was Mendez who found it first. They were hacking their way through thick brush on a ridge west of the ironbark grove when he stopped abruptly, his machete mid-swing. "Aqui," he said, his voice barely above a breath. Eric stepped past him and into the clearing. The trees ended without warning cut off, like they'd been afraid to grow any farther. The air was still heavy. Even the insects had gone quiet. In the center of the clearing, laid out in a near-perfect circle, were bones, dozens of them, bleached white, some shattered, others intact, human, adult, most likely. Kneecaps. A femur, several ribs, arranged deliberately. They weren't buried, they had been placed. Between the bones were remnants of something older, blackened candle wax melted into the soil, a shallow bowl carved from stone, filled with long-dried crimson residue. Charcoal symbols scrawled around the perimeter, some matching the ones carved into trees days earlier. And at the very center of the circle, resting atop a flat, moss-covered rock, was a necklace. A silver chain, delicate, twisted from exposure but unmistakable. Eva's. Eric collapsed to his knees before he even realized he'd moved. He reached for it, hands trembling, brushing away the dirt with shaking fingers. The clasp was broken, the pendant missing. He had given her this necklace on her 25th birthday in Old Norse charm for protection. He looked around the clearing. Mendez stood on the edge, machete drawn. Lucas muttered a prayer under his breath, backing away. "What is this?" Eric whispered. Mendez answered slowly. "A ritual, or a warning, maybe both." There were no grave markers, no signs of struggle, no belongings, except the necklace. Whoever or whatever had created this didn't want to hide it. They wanted it found. Eric slipped the necklace into his pocket, the metal cold against his skin despite the heat. He didn't want to ask what the others were thinking. Was she one of them, or one of the offerings? The wind picked up, sudden and sour. Mendez stepped back. "We shouldn't stay." Eric lingered just a moment longer, staring at the circle, trying to understand its message. But the bones said nothing. They had already told their story. It was 2 days later, just as they were about to turn back. The forest had grown denser, more oppressive. Eric hadn't spoken much since the clearing. The others kept their distance, still committed, but wary. Everyone could feel it now. They were deeper than they should be, far past maps, past reason. The jungle wasn't just watching anymore. It was leading. They followed an old animal trail, barely visible, when they saw the edge of a palisade wall-rotted wood rising from the ground like broken teeth. The path widened into a clearing, and there, half swallowed by vines and leaf fall, lay the ruins of a village. 12 structures, maybe more, built from wood and woven fronds, collapsing under years of neglect. A central fire pit choked with moss. Cooking tools left to rust. Hammocks still strung between support beams, sagging with rain. It was as if the inhabitants had vanished mid-morning. But what struck them first, what stopped all 3 men in their tracks, were the handprints. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Smeared in red pigment, covering every wall, doorway, and pole. Small hands, large hands. Some dragged downward like their owners had been pulled away mid-stroke. Others formed rings or spirals. A few, in stark contrast, were black. Lucas refused to enter. Mendez only went 2 steps in before stopping cold. "No signs of struggle," he said quietly, "but no sign of life either." They checked each hut. No bodies, no bones, no personal belongings. Just the handprints, the silence, and a sense of absence so profound it felt like a pressure in the air. Then Eric found something in the central hut. A woven mat covered in mold. Beneath it, folded and wrapped in waxy leaves, was a piece of notebook paper, torn, stained, but still readable. Scrawled in shaky English, "I think I was one of them, but I remembered too much. I think that's why they left." No name, no signature, but the handwriting, Eric recognized it instantly. It was Eva's. This wasn't a random village. This was where she'd stayed. And something had happened here, something that made everyone else disappear, and left only ghosts behind. They hadn't noticed the hut at first. It was sunken into the ground, nearly buried under vines and moss, its roof collapsed inward like a forgotten tomb. It sat apart from the others, half hidden behind a curtain of dense undergrowth, as though the forest itself had tried to reclaim it more aggressively. Mendez hesitated, but Eric walked straight in. The air inside was stale and sweet, thick with the scent of decaying leaves and something older in scents, maybe, or the dried petals of jungle flowers left too long in the heat. The walls were covered in faded cloth, painted with symbols that mirrored the ones carved into trees miles away. In the center of the room sat a low altar, nothing grand, just a slab of stone propped up on bones. Human bones. On the altar, a collection of objects so personal, so specific, Eric's breath caught in his throat. A pair of hiking socks sewn bald, the other folded. A laminated ID badge from the Swedish National Botanical Institute. Faded, cracked. A photo. Taken years before. Eva in a garden, laughing. Her hair pulled back in a braid. Eric remembered that day. He had taken the picture. There were more burned-out candles arranged in a ring, dried orchids twisted into crude shapes, and then, set at the back of the altar in a place of eerie prominence, a skull. It wasn't Eva's. That much was clear. The size and shape were wrong, larger, masculine, with a jagged fracture along the brow. A tribal warrior? A rival? A sacrifice? The skull had been painted with stripes of red and black, the eye socket stuffed with petals, its jaw tied shut with sinew. Something sacred, or something feared. Eric stood frozen. He didn't know if this was a shrine to Eva or to whatever had taken her. Some of the items looked like tributes, others like warnings. Behind the altar, carved into the wood in deep, looping slashes, were words. In Swedish, "She became the bridge." Eric stepped back, pulse roaring in his ears. This wasn't abandonment. It wasn't survival. It was transformation. That night, they made camp just upriver from the village, too disturbed to sleep among its walls. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and ash. Mendez didn't speak. Lucas sharpened his blade with slow, deliberate strokes. Eric sat on a rock, Ava's photograph in his hands, his thoughts a carousel of memory and dread. The river moved silently beside them, black and slow, like oil under moonlight. The fire crackled. Insects chirped. Then the jungle went quiet. Not slowly, not gradually. Instantly. Like something had entered the clearing that didn't belong. Mendez looked up first. His hand went to his machete, eyes fixed on the opposite bank. And Eric saw them too. Figures. 7, maybe 8. Barefoot. Thin. Unmoving. They stood just beyond the waterline, obscured by shadow, but clearly human, or at least human-shaped. Their faces were masked, covered in something bone-white and smooth, like bark or clay. No eye holes, no mouths, just featureless ovals watching from across the dark. No sound, no movement. Lucas whispered, "Now son tribo, not a tribe." Eric stepped forward, slowly, holding Eva's photo out as if they might recognize her. The figures didn't react. Then, as suddenly as they'd appeared, they were gone. No splash, no retreating steps. Just gone. The jungle sounds didn't return for another hour. None of the men slept. They kept the fire burning high, their weapons close. At dawn, Mendez crossed the river to check for tracks. There were none, no indentations in the mud, no broken reeds. The opposite bank looked untouched, as if the figures had never existed. But Eric knew better. They had seen them, and whatever they were, uncontacted, tribe, forest guardians, something else entirely, they had been watching. Not curious, not hostile, just aware. And in that awareness, Eric felt a warning. You've come far enough. By the time they returned to camp, the photograph was damp from Eric's grip, and the fire had burned down to embers. Mendez sat with his back to a tree, chewing dried cassava in silence. Lucas hadn't spoken since the figures vanished. Eric pulled out Eva's notebook again, flipping past the sketches, the warnings, the spirals. Then he found it. A folded page, taped to the inside cover. Not a note, but a map hand-drawn, ink faded but clear. Topographical lines. Landmarks he recognized from their route. The Ironbark Grove, the Handprint Village, the Circle of Bones, each location marked with care. But there was something else, something he hadn't noticed before. A symbol in the lower quadrant. A circle with a vertical slash through it. Not labeled cave, or clearing, or camp. Labeled simply, the door. Next to it, written in tight, uneven letters, was a line that chilled Eric more than any ghost story could. This is where they came through. This is where I changed. He showed the map to Mendez. The guide stared at it for a long time, then shook his head slowly. This is near Pedra Negra. Black stone. No one goes there. Why not? Eric asked. Because it's not a place, Mendez said. It's a memory. Lucas crossed himself and spat into the dirt. Cursed. According to legend, the area was home to a collapsed mountain temple, older than any tribal memory. A rift in the rock where the forest breathes different, where animals will not den and people return. Wrong. Locals spoke of lights that moved without fire, of dreams that bled into waking, of people who went in searching for things and came back speaking languages no one knew. Most never came back at all. Eric didn't hesitate. The cave was less than a day's walk. He packed light. He marked the map. And when dawn broke, he led them toward the place Eva had called the door. He didn't know what he'd find, only that she had found it first. They reached it by dusk. The jungle thinned just enough to reveal the stone facing a crumbling wall of black rock jutting from the earth like the broken jaw of a buried god. Cracks split its surface. Moss clung to the stone in pulsing green sheets, and tree roots spilled over its crown like veins. At its center was the cave, a narrow opening, no more than 6 feet tall, shaped like an inverted eye. The air that drifted out from it was cold, unnaturally smelling of rust, wet earth, and something older than rot. Mendez refused to go further. Lucas stayed behind to stand watch. Eric entered alone. His headlamp flickered against the wall, smooth at first, then jagged, then covered in crude, ancient pigment. Paintings, dozens of them. The first layer showed hunters and animals normal, mundane. But as Eric moved deeper, the figures began to twist. Men without faces, creatures with limbs like vines. One panel showed human shapes melting into trees, their fingers becoming branches, their legs tangled in roots. Another showed a circle of people kneeling before a massive flower, its petals open like a mouth, teeth blooming where seeds should be. And then came the final image, etched into the stone at the end of the tunnel. Faint, but unmistakable. A woman standing at the mouth of the cave, surrounded by faceless figures, her arms outstretched, her body blooming into tendrils. Her face, Eva's face. Eric stared, unable to breathe. He stepped closer, running his fingers along the cold surface. The wall pulsed beneath his hand. Behind him, a breeze stirred, but there was no wind, just breath. The cave wasn't just a place. It was alive, and Eva hadn't just passed through it. She had become part of it. It was wedged beneath a pile of stone at the base of the final chamber, just beyond the painting of the woman blooming into vines. A dull flash of orange plastic buried under dust, soot, and time. Eric spotted it as he turned to leave, barely visible in the low light of his flickering headlamp. A voice recorder. Scratched, mold-streaked, battery corroded, but intact. He held it in his hand like an artifact pulled from another world. It was an old model, the same kind Eva had carried in the early stages of her career, simple, durable, designed for field notes. His fingers trembled as he opened the battery compartment and replaced the corroded cell with one of his own. A red light blinked. It still worked. There were 3 recordings on the device. The first 2 were static fragmented files filled with crunching sounds, hissing wind, and broken echoes. But the third played. Eva's voice. Tired, thready, but unmistakable. "I found it," she said. A pause. A breath. "I followed the trail past the grove, past the stones. There's something here, under the earth. It's not dead, not asleep. It's watching." The audio cracked. Her voice returned, fainter now. "I think this place is alive. It knows things. It learns you. Every sound I make, it holds on to it. The walls, they breathe sometimes." Another pause. Then, "I tried to leave yesterday, backtracked for hours, but the path was gone. The trees weren't the same. Even the sky changed. I don't think it will let me go." Silence. A breath caught halfway between fear and resignation. "If anyone hears this, tell Eric I'm sorry. I shouldn't have gone alone. I thought I could. I thought I could understand it. But this isn't science." Her voice faltered. "This is something else." The recording ended with a soft mechanical click, and nothing more. Eric sat on the cave floor, the recorder pressed to his forehead, shaking. She had been alive. Trapped. Lost. Not taken in a moment of panic but held. By something that didn't understand mercy. The cave groaned. Not metaphorically, not in Eric's head. The stone itself shifted with a deep, grinding moan that echoed through the tunnel like a wounded animal. Dust fell from the ceiling in thin streams. The floor beneath Eric's boots trembled. He turned and ran. Outside the main chamber, Mendez was shouting, his silhouette jerking in and out of view as his headlamp bounced wildly. "Go!" he yelled. "Agora! It's coming down!" Eric didn't ask questions. He sprinted. The walls contracted around them. Roots twisted from the stone, reaching like fingers. The air grew hot, wet, charged like the moment before lightning strikes. Another deep rumble shook the tunnel. This one louder. Closer. More final. As they reached the entrance chamber, the ceiling cracked above them with a sound like thunder underwater. Then came the collapse. A wall of rock and black earth tumbled down in a roar of dust and force. Mendez dove forward, dragging Eric by the collar. Lucas screamed, his leg caught beneath a falling slab, his body pinned. Mendez turned back, eyes wide. Eric moved before he could think. Together, they pulled Lucas free, his face pale, shin twisted at a sickening angle but alive. The three of them scrambled the last few meters to the cave's mouth, bursting into humid daylight just as the tunnel behind them sealed itself in a blast of stone and soil. Silence returned. Not the silence of peace, but the thick, heavy kind. The kind that knows what you've seen and waits for it to break you. Eric lay in the moss, covered in cuts, mud, and ash, staring up at the trees. Mendez leaned against a boulder, panting. Lucas moaned, clutching his leg. Behind them, the entrance to the cave was gone. Buried. As if it had never existed. They had come looking for Eva. And they had found her, pieces of her, echoes of her, the last words she ever spoke. But whatever else had lived in that cave had made its choice. It had let them go. Just barely. The bones were sent back quietly. Eric didn't announce the discovery. Not to the press. Not even to Eva's parents. Not yet. He needed to be sure, he needed proof. 2 femurs, several smaller fragments, and a partial jaw retrieved from the circle of bones had been secured in dry containers, smuggled out of the jungle with the help of a field medic and a biologist friend at a regional lab. The results came 3 weeks later. The call came at night, just past midnight, from a quiet-voiced geneticist who didn't ask questions, only gave answers. "It's her," he said. "Mitochondrial DNA is a match, no doubt. The remains belong to Eva Sorensen." Eric stood in silence, holding the receiver, the weight of 5 years crashing into his chest all at once. He wanted to scream, he wanted to collapse, but mostly he felt numb. Because part of him had always known. The bones, the necklace, the recording set had all been building to this. But there was something else. "There's a second profile," the geneticist added. "We isolated another set of mitochondrial DNA from the same site. Different gender. Likely male. Unrelated. Possibly mixed in the same ritual pattern. Could be centuries old. But..." Eric's voice was barely a whisper. "But what?" "The sequences show damage, not decay. Mutation. Fragmentation that doesn't match any known environmental exposure." "Human?" A pause. "It was human. Once." The words rang like a bell in Eric's skull. 2 sets of remains. 1 Eva's. 1. Something else. Something that didn't age like normal tissue. Something warped by time, exposure, or something deeper. Something unnatural. He asked for the second sample to be preserved. But the geneticist had already tried. The remains had blackened overnight, turned to dust in the storage case. There was nothing left to test. And Eric was left with only 2 facts. His sister had died. But she had not died alone. The village lay 3 rivers west of the Javari's edge, isolated, unreachable except by dugout canoe, and known only to a handful of anthropologists. Eric had passed through it once, years ago, in the early stages of the search. Back then, the people had turned away, refused to speak her name, refused to speak at all. But now, something had changed. Word of the bones had spread, of the cave, of the shrine, of the strange symbols in Eva's notebook that matched older tribal markings never shared with outsiders. And now, the elder agreed to speak. His name was Aratana, wrinkled, stone-faced, eyes like smoke. He listened as Eric spoke of Eva's journey of the orchids, the descent, the voice recordings. When Eric finished, Aratana nodded slowly. "We saw her," he said. Eric froze. "When?" "Months after the sky broke with thunder," Aratana said, referring to a great storm that had hit the Javari 6 months after Eva's disappearance. "She walked along the riverbank, alone, no shoes, hair tangled, eyes not looking at anything. She did not speak." "You didn't help her?" Eric asked. "She did not need help. She was not lost," the elder said. "She was becoming." "Becoming what?" The elder glanced at the jungle, then leaned closer. "One of them." He went on to describe osque mudamde, ones who change. Not people, not spirits, something in between. Forest-touched, chosen, or cursed, to act as bridges between worlds. They live in silence. They speak through roots and shadow. They do not age. They do not leave. And once someone begins to change, the tribe does not interfere. They become watchers, Aritana said. We turn our eyes away. Eric asked if she was still alive. The elder did not answer. He only gestured to the forest and said, if she is not yours to find. Then he stood, and the conversation was over. But Eric knew what the silence meant. Ava had walked out of the jungle once. But she never really came back. The facts were laid out. Bones confirmed. A necklace recovered. Voice logs, photos, and a notebook that read like a slow surrender. Villagers who claimed to have seen her walking, barefoot, eyes empty, months after her disappearance. But none of it pointed to a single truth. What happened to Eva Sorensen? Some experts leaned towards psychological collapse. Isolation, dehydration, hallucinogenic plants, plenty of natural triggers could explain her descent. Perhaps she became disoriented, succumbed to exposure, and died near the cave. The symbols, the rituals, the shrine explained away as the fevered mind of a brilliant but unraveling scientist. But Eric didn't buy that. Not after hearing her voice. Not after reading her final entries. And certainly not after what he saw inside the cave. Some suggested she encountered an uncontacted tribe. That they took her in, transformed her, erased her. But what tribe paints the walls in human-animal hybrids and speaks in symbols that predate known languages? What tribe leaves bones in perfect circles and figures massed in bark on the riverbanks? No, this wasn't assimilation. It was something else. Something deeper. Something sacred, or cursed. There's a line in Eva's notebook that Eric returns to often. Scrawled sideways in the margin, barely readable. If understanding costs you your name, your past, your voice, would you still choose to see? He wonders if Ava did choose. If, at some point in the forest's vast silence, she was offered a way forward and took it. Not escape, not survival. But transformation. Perhaps the cave was the threshold, the shrine, a baptism, the mask of petals, a final crown. Or maybe she died terrified and alone, her mind broken by the weight of unexplainable things. Either way, the forest didn't steal her in the dark. She walked into it, and it closed behind her. 5 years, 3 months, and 19 days after Eva vanished, Eric stood once again at the edge of the Javari. Older, quieter, changed in ways even he couldn't articulate. The river still moved the same way, the trees still whispered their secrets, and somewhere in that endless sea of green, his sister still lived in bone, in myth, in the breath of the jungle. He didn't come to search anymore. He came to remember. To sit on the bank where the masked figures once stood and listen to the water murmur stories in a language he didn't understand. The Amazon forgets nothing. It doesn't forgive, and it doesn't explain. Sometimes it returns the people it take a shaken, scarred, silent. Sometimes it doesn't, but it always remembers. And if you listen closely, when the wind cuts just right through the canopy, you might hear her voice not calling for help, but singing something soft. Something not quite human anymore. Eva Sorensen vanished in pursuit of a flower. But what she found was a truth older than time. And now, she is part of the forest. Not lost. Just changed. This story was intense. But this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.